If you're getting bored of set 10, Riot has introduced set 3.5 Revival to give us a blast from the past and get a refreshing take on what set 3 would be like if we had augments. It's a really fun twist from a set nearly 4 years ago that was super popular with some names of comps that I don't think is really appropriate to talk about in the intro. But it can be really overwhelming if you've never played it or you forgot completely what the set was about. So here's my ultimate tier list to walk it through. So let's talk about the tier list and also some reasoning as to why these comps are really, really strong. Starting from the very top, we have Xin Zhao and Celestial Protectors featuring Ashe as your backline carry. The main reason why I think this comp is obnoxiously good and the best comp in the game is because of the item changes. I'm pretty sure that explains actually most of the tier placements for a lot of these comps, because even though 3.5 was fairly balanced, a lot of things has changed around the game, like augments and items. And one of the biggest changes is that the defensive build for Xin Zhao with things like Bramble Declaw and Warmogs all give a lot of scaling HP, and Protectors scale off of their max HP. In the past, Bramble Declaw did something really different, like Bramble stopped crits and gave you a bunch of armor, and Declaw just gave you a bunch of magic resistance. Now they give you so much max HP, which scales the tankiness of Xin Zhao and helps you stall infinite for things like the Rage Blade, Shojin, Ashe to cast infinite. And you have this really toxic gameplay loop where Xin Zhao shields and Rakan ends up disarming, and then that stalls long enough for Ashe to get online and then cast an Ice Arrow to freeze, which in result gives more time for the Xin Zhao to cast, so on and so forth. So as long as you're able to get like the really good items onto Xin Zhao, this guy becomes unkillable and you're going to be able to go basically infinite against most comps. And you're very stable at 2 stars for the most part. Like a lot of times you can just get Xin Zhao 2, Rakan 2 for very cheap, and then you end up having unkillable frontline in the early mid game. Gives you a lot of time to reroll, and if you get Ashe 3, Xin Zhao 3, Rakan 3, you're good to go. Ezreal is also the beneficiary of all the AP item buffs. Things like Death Cap and giving bonus damage is insane, and that's something that didn't exist really back then. And AP in general is very dominant this set for 3.5 because for whatever reason, Riot decided to make, 80% of the cast just deal AP scaling and nothing with AD. We learned a lot of lessons from TFT basically, starting from 3.5 onwards. So, after this set is when they started mixing a lot of AD and AP. And so if you have a bunch of rods, the best comp to probably think about is Ezreal, because the Chrono gives him a bunch of attack speed. You give him some kind of mana generation like Shojin, and you just have him scale. So I think it's like Shojin, Deathcap, and JG for Ezreal. Riven's going to be your secondary carry a lot of times if you can give her items. Make sure you have good frontline. Shen 3 holds all the items, and if you can get stuff on Wukong as your secondary, that's also good. And then if you end up hitting Thresh, it ends up being able to summon like a bunch of stuff. But it's actually really fun because it's a straight up like giga attack speed juiced comp. You just go crazy, and you get to watch Ezreal pop off. Teemo is the most flexible and powerful 4 cost to play around. I mean, it's an AP set. They buffed all the AP items, and Teemo is the best AP 4 cost in the game. You can actually have a lot of flexibility playing around Astros snipers specifically. So all you need is 3 Astro and 2 snipers that you can flex around the rest. You can play like a Brawler frontline. You can play like a Vanguard frontline. You can do anything as long as it kind of makes sense. You basically play a core of Teemo, Gnar, and Nautilus as Astro plus 1 sniper, usually Jhin because it's another 4 cost, and then anything else that makes sense. 4 sniper, Chrono, Vanguards, Mystics, whatever else you really need. And in general, like as I've kind of talked about, there's so much AP damage, so don't forget to tech in a lot of Mystics. That could be pretty useful if you're trying to beat a lot of those boards. And Teemo ends up being really good against melee as well because the satellite mushrooms end up really giving a lot of hard time for those melee carries. So if you end up protecting Teemo really well against infiltrators, for example, that are melee, if you cubby Teemo in like the C1 corner or somewhere in the shoulder, he should be actually really safe and be able to fight really well against melee carries. This is in contrast to someone like Jhin, who really needs to have that distance from front to back. Otherwise, Jin's going to get swarmed and get destroyed by all the melee carries. Speaking of melee carries, let's go to the A tier and look at the classic Mastery and Yasuo combination. This is a comp that went by the quite PG-17 version name called Bang Bros, where you would have Yasuo 3 and Master E3 go kind of crazy and dual hypo carry. Mastery scales, Yasuo casts the CC, and then you just have them go kind of a nice little rush hour 1-2 punch. Very, very fun. In fact, I think this is probably the most popular comp in the set right now, largely because of nostalgia. It's just really, really fun to play. Also captures the power fantasy of Mastery really well. I don't think we've ever seen like a Mastery hyper carry sim like this. Even though he was a 5 cost in set 2, I think set 3 Mastery was really capturing the Mastery spirit. Mastery really wants Quicksilver and Rage Blade, and the last item could just be like whatever, just to help scale him. A lot of people pick Titans. But you can also play like BT and Hodge and anything else that makes sense for him. Yasuo also takes like Titans BT as well. And you really play around Shen as your frontliner for Blade Masters. Definitely take things like long distance pals and Gifts of the Fall and things like that just really help your Mastery go super crazy. Gargantuan Resolve is also something to think about too. Shaco is the best backline access carry because he can really jump on things like Ezreal and Ashe, and then also has flexibility with what you end up outfitting him with. A lot of times, the most important thing is just to get the infiltrators with things like Fizz. But if you do end up getting a Darkstar variant, you can play around Darkstar Shaco, which is really good. Or you can play Mech Infiltrator. That's right, me Mech, no scout, no pivot, originated from this. You play Shaco as your infiltrator alongside Zed, and then you try to 3-star like Annie and Rumble as well. I personally think Darkstar caps much higher because if you're able to get, you know, the Darkstar buffs, it's really, really powerful. Darkstar is Gifts of the Fallen, the augments. In fact, a lot of the traits from this set is what originate a lot of the augment inspiration, like Cybernetic Bulk is from Cybernetics. And so the analog to that is Gifts of the Fallen is Darkstar, the trait. Make sure you give Shaco Edge of Night, and he can really hyper carry because he just gets all the Darkstar stuff, and it's really funny to see him 2 auto tap every unit as all the allies die. But make sure you have like that big tank. Mech is really, really important for that reason because the mech stalls and casts and AoE CCs, and then you get the Shaco to kill everything. And wrapping up A tier is Fast 9 Legendaries. This is what we called the Peba comp back in the day because it was a player on the ladder named Peba who would Fast 9 literally every game, playing around like things like Bard and stacking up meeps, and then trying to get to 9 and play like every 5 costs in the game. Basically, as long as you're able to get things that really make sense, like, you know, stuff that makes sense for ASOL, like Morello and a bunch of AP items, and then getting like Gangplank and Echo and all this different stuff, you just basically win through sheer value. This is gonna be really open-ended because you can play like a mixture of a bunch of stuff, but as long as you're playing like really strong 5 costs that make sense and you upgrade all of them, you should be able to top 4 very easily and just beat everything else out sheerly just in terms of value. B tier is also stuff that can top 4, but it's usually like depending on when you hit. Kog'Maw Battlecast reroll is something that I actually didn't really even understand very much myself in 3.5. Back when this was a set, I actually played this comp the least, but I saw a lot of people rerolling it. You're basically trying to go for Kog'Maw 3 as fast as you can, and then maybe use like Alawi and Rakan as some of your frontliners of choice, and then you play like Cassio as your secondary. Rageblade is really, really good on him, and some kind of shred is really powerful. Also just scales really nicely off of AP, so if you go like, you know, Rageblade, Deathcap, it's also probably really good. JG, Giant Slayer, just have him just like take down a bunch of tanks really fast as best as you can. I'm not super convinced by it. I think it's kind of equivalent to like Punk in set 10 right now, which is just like you play for top 4 and you just get your reroll comps online and you just try to win the game. Caitlyn reroll is pretty funny actually because Caitlyn is usually really good early game to kill a unit in the backline with her ace in the hole, and if you get her to 3-star with Celestial, ends up being kind of a inferior version to this comp with Ashe, but instead of playing Ashe as a main sniper, you can play around Caitlyn. Does have a couple of really interesting matchups because if you snipe Teemo, for example, they lose a lot of damage, and so Caitlyn can actually do decently well, but again, largely carried by the fact that Chrono is really good and Celestial protectors are really busted. So it's kind of like an off-meta version of playing the top 2 comps. Caitlyn just wants to cast a lot, so a lot of times people play like, you know, Rageblade Shojin and just let her go Super Saiyan, but you can just also give her some damage items if it makes sense. Jinx is the 84 cost that I would play around as opposed to Jhin because I just think her blaster trait is really easy to get procs off of, but she's just lower power level relative to everything else. It's not that she's bad. Give her things like red buff and then 80 items, Infinity Edge, Deathblade, Last Whisper, GS, Runins, things like that is pretty good. The really awkward thing is the trait pathing for blasters. Blasters are mainly AP champions for some reason, like Kog'Maw and Lucian, and then how do you have it like item hold into Jinx? I think that's like the biggest thing holding Jinx back is just that your early mid game is nowhere near as solid as everything else, which gets online. You're just going to be struggling a lot. So Jinx, I think, is in B tier, and she can do well. It's just you need to have everything go well. The nice thing is that you do cap out pretty high if you're able to get things like Gangplank, and Gangplank can be really powerful as a late game nuke option. C tier are things that are like, you know, probably going to bot 4, but if you want to play something a little bit different and you have a good spot for it, you can probably sneak in a really solid result. First we can go is the Star Guardian Sorcerers featuring Syndra as your main carry. Part of the reason why Star Guardians is a lot weaker is because in set 3, blue buff used to be able to stack. Back then, it actually wasn't blue buff. It was, I think, Archangel's Embrace or Seraph's Embrace or something like that. It's like some kind of blue buff where you can get like 6 tiers and you could put them all onto different champions and let them go crazy with the amount of mana that they could get. Now blue buff is unique, so you can't actually get multiple blue buffs. Syndra just wants a lot of mana items and like a JG or a Deathcap, so you just have her go crazy, and then you stack Ahri as your secondary. Make sure Nico is tanky in your front line, and if you can get Jan at the very top, she ends up being really good. Vayne is also another good carry to play around in the early mid game, and if you want to lean into Vayne Carry as one of the few AD champions of the set, you can play around her. She ends up being actually a really good item holder into Jinx, so you can often play Cybernetic Opener into something like Jinx if you really want to. Or if you want to reroll Vayne, she ends up being really, really solid and ends up being very powerful if you have a lot of combat augments in general. Vayne's best item usually is Rageblade because she just has so much AD and she wants to scale in the fight. But if you're not going to play Rageblade, just try to go for straight up AD on her. It kind of reminds me of Misfortune from set 10. Such high base damage and you want her to cast pretty often. But the main difference is that her cast actually gives her some evasion because she tumbles and then becomes untargetable. So she kind of has like a built-in Edge of Night. So just give her like the big juicer AD items and she will turbo carry. Secondary carry is oftentimes Irelia, but it's just, again, kind of lower power level relative to everything else once they get online. Vayne's just going to struggle with the big super tanks like Xin Zhao and Shen that gives dodge and also the mechs. So it's just unfortunate that Shen is so popular in the meta of the game because these AD comps like Jinx and Vayne are going to struggle. Rebels featuring Gangplank as your top end is also in the C tier only because I think they nerfed it a lot. There's a patch where Rebels was actually the best comp in the game. And statistically, I think it might have been the best comp in the game ever based off of the stat tracking that we had available to us. Set 3 was basically the first time we ever tracked stats of comp performance. We didn't have like augment data and all these other different things we can do now, but we were able to track raw average placements of comps. And I think at one point, Rebels averaged something in like the low 3s because of how broken it was when you hit Gangplank 1. And if you hit Gangplank 1, he just like insta-class and destroyed everything. And I think Riot ended up nerfing it a lot and Rebels ended up becoming way more tame. And also late game positioning can also be a grief if you end up just clumping up and people end up punishing that with, you know, relevant units. Like if you have Ashe and she just AoE with the ice arrow, you're just going to be in really big trouble, or Teemo's AoE. So Rebels just struggles with like late game positioning. You just grief yourself a lot of times. Same logic as like Keepers. Right now in the current set, it's like kind of really need a very good excuse to play Keepers, and you just don't really have that right now with Rebels. Isn't give enough. But if you get upgrade Gangplank and you're able to get, you know, really powerful setup around all of the Rebel units, yeah, maybe you can top 4. It's okay. If you play around Rebels, a lot of times you play around Jinx or maybe even reroll Ziggs. And then D tier is just comps for nostalgia purposes. Darius is like, you know, D tier. He's not very good, but he does a bunch of cool Dunkmaster Space Jam stuff. He jumps up, slams, everyone plays a Space Jam theme song in the background, and you get to farm a bunch of stuff of Space Pirates. Kind of like Spoils of War, the trait. And it's very fun. You play him kind of like Katarina this set. You just give like Jewel Gauntlet plus Hodge and just give him a bunch of damage and healing and just have Darius try to go reset, and then farm a bunch of gold and resources. And you do want to max the amount of Space Pirates if you play this build because if you don't, then what's the point? Cassiopeia Jace is also Vanguard Mystics, which is another throwback where you kind of play all the defensive traits and you carry via Jace and Cassiopeia as your 3-cost reroll. It's very weak. It just doesn't do enough damage. And while it is okay, while it's fun to kind of play like all defensive traits and just have like one of them carry, it ends up just giving too much time for everybody else to get online and doesn't do enough damage. Xin Zhao Celestial Protectors is pretty much set in the core of these 6 units on the right. Nico, Xin Zhao, Jarvan, Ashe, Karma, Rakan. Jin, Zai are just extra units for you to play. Zai is an extra Celestial unit. Jin is just the best sniper you could play, but if you play Threes of Crowd, for example, you want to replace this Jin with probably a Vayne, so you get 3 costs, and you just get infinite HP on your Xin Zhao. The more HP, the better, and that just ends up becoming really, really insane for this composition. Don't forget about things like Impenetrable Bulwark, which just gives you like a straight up Bramble Declaw, which is insane for Xin Zhao. Like, build your own Xin Zhao immediately. And then don't forget that you scale off of HP, so things like Martyr ends up being really good. You probably actually want to position Karma like here so that she guarantees gets a tether on Ashe. And then also don't forget about things like Blitzcrank, Rakan in the corner because he can walk up and also do a bunch of stuns, but to bait the Blitzcranks. Jarvan ends up giving AoE attack speed to people within 3 hexes. So this ends up being kind of a nice little pocket for him. And you don't really care where Nico is as long as she just gets the AoE stun, kind of like where Echo is for set 10 at the moment. Straightforward. Try to go for 3-star here, 3-star here, 3-star here. And if you can 3-star all this, you're good to go. Maybe even Rakan as well. One very specific unique interaction that I really love is that Rakan scales off of his attack range. This used to make Rapid Fire Cannon, the old one that gave you +1 attack range, really, really fun on Rakan because you could go like from one side of the map to the other and disarm everything. So if you want to just have a little bit of meme fun, just put Sniper's Focus on Rakan and just watch him go annoy your opponents in the back line. You can actually cap the board really high if you play Protector on Aurelion Soul. It's actually a very strong combination because Aurelion Soul spam casts, and that works really well with Protector in particular. So if you do, make sure to try to play around Asol as a win condition. And in this case, you can go for a 6 Protector and go for Urgot, and Urgot ends up being a nice win condition. In this spot, you would drop something like the Karma as the Mystic, and you can play Lulu as your cap. And this is what partially makes this composition really insane, is if you can get a high cap like this, you're going to be quite unstoppable. Chrono Ezreal is pretty straightforward. You see Chrono, you play Chrono, you watch attack speed go higher, dopamine hits drip into the brain. It's a fun time. Back Ezreal 3 with the Shojin mana item generation. You can also do Nashers, for example, but you really get a lot of attack speed. Then you also go for JG plus Death Cap for maximum damage output. You get something like Jewel Lotus, you can go for another item instead, like Giant Slayer or something else that makes sense. Shen takes defensive items. Don't play because you solo frontline him a lot because there's not many tanks in this comp. Blitzcrank is in the corner because, you know, kind of helps bait the other Blitzcranks plus gives Ezreal like an easy target. But if you don't want to do that, you can go ahead and put like Wukong here instead and have Blitzcrank pull a unit here, and then Ezreal AoEs the front line. You end up casting a lot because you get so much attack speed, you generate a ton of mana, so combat caster ends up being really good. And one augment I think is really fun is learning the spell, because you get early Ezreal, you scale that Ezreal, you just get a lot of ton of AP, and maybe instead of a death cap, you get to go for, you know, the Giga Juice, going for like Shojin Nashers, going crazy with Ezreal and spam casting. It's probably really fun. I've never actually got to pull it off, but I looked at the stats and it should be okay. If you do end up getting another +1, like you try to go for 9th units, if you're just playing 4 to 6 Chrono, you can just kind of fit in whatever traits make sense. So +1 Brawler for frontline, Sorcerer gives your team AP, you know, maybe you want a Mana Reaver so you can get extra, you know, mana reaving, I guess. Mana reaving is like the shroud effect from the item, so increases max mana. So yeah, that used to be a trait before it became a support item. So yeah, just a lot of options. You don't really lack DPS. You pretty much usually lack frontline. It's usually depending on how fast you can hit Gen 3. So try to make sure you don't die. Teemo is pretty open-ended because all you really need is 3 Astro and 2 Sniper, and you can kind of play whatever you want. You can go for 4 Sniper like Vayne and Ashe, for example, and then, oh look, you have like Celestial, so why don't you tech in the ability for everyone to get Omnivamp? So you can play like Lulu, for example. Oh, I have a Mystic and a Dark Star. Why not tech in something like a Karma? And then you kind of have a board like this. You are lacking frontline, so I put things like Crash Test Dummies or Stationary Support. Anything that can help give you a little bit of extra frontline to just keep that distance for Teemo is really, really good. 4 Sniper generally is worth it if you can, because the 16 damage per hex is pretty nuts. Also, if you have something like Silver Veil, you can actually just straight up like put the snipers in the corners, which is really important for Blitzcrank. So you stop the first initial Blitzcrank hook. Silver Veil in general is probably like a really nutty augment in general, anytime you're playing a range backline carry whatsoever. Or probably just in general. It's probably is the best silver you could have right now in the set. Another variation you can play is just literally just click all the brawlers. So you can just play Brawler, Brawler, and Brawler. And guess what? Now you have a really cheap front line. You can play like this and you get a lot of damage. It has the inverse problem of the other version, which is you have too much front line in a way, and they're all a bunch of low cost units that aren't particularly really powerful. So if you do end up playing something like this, try to supplement through other forms of damage. Maybe even playing 2 Teemos is not even a bad thing. I'm now able to play like double Teemo. And you can always just mix and match. So say you're playing Magic Wand, you get a bunch of AP items. You can play like, you know, Xerath, Victor, get Tekken Sorcerers. Oh, we're missing kind of frontline stuff. Maybe I'll just Tekken like Wukong and play like a Vanguard and just have like a nice balance comp like this. You can do a bunch of different ways to outfit Teemo, just make him carry. Just make sure you have blue buff, Morello, Death Cap, like some combination is really, really good. Morello is just overstated still, because it gives you a bunch of attack speed and ability power, and also anti-heals everything, which is really, really good. Also, don't forget about Shred. Make sure you have something like Spark on a unit, so that way you can have the Teemo explode and watch your enemy's board disappear. Jin takes over after 80 items. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. That's what you usually do with all your swords and your bows. Bang Bros is really dependent on whether or not you're able to hit Master E as a 3-star. And then if you can get Shen as your front line, and then ideally Yasuo as your 3rd priority, it's really, really good. Gargantuan Resolve is particularly good with Master E because you just give him a bunch of that scaling stats, and he ends up becoming an unkillable carry if you get Quicksilver and Rageblade on him. Long Distance Palace is also good for the very same reason. If you're able to somehow combine both of this, you will just win the game, I think. And any kind of healing is good. Harm Assist, Healing Orbs, you know, so on and so forth. Vampirism, all very, very good for Master E. The 7 units are pretty much guaranteed with this core when you end up playing around 6 Blade Masters, 3 Cybers, and 2 Chrono. You get the team-wide attack speed. If you do make it to 8, just play something that makes sense. So a Rebel is okay, but keep in mind that you're not trying to like clump very often. You can just play like anything else that makes sense. If you do manage to hit Echo, for example, Echo is probably a much better cybernetic than Vi, but Vi is just really cheap to get compared to Echo. Positioning wise, you have Mastery in the 2nd row, so he doesn't draw aggro too quickly, and you kind of use Shen as a opportunity to get the dodge. Yasuo and Vi both target the farthest enemy, so you kind of want them on the opposite side of Mastery so they can kind of join in the fight and help CC around this area. And Irelia is kind of closer to Mastery because she's more likely to get a reset, and Riven's just kind of a synergy bot. If you're able to get a Thresh as well, Thresh can be really good at 8 over Riven. If you do end up getting Thresh, play her over Riven, and then just play like Zaya in the back. to make sure you get the Blade Master in. Also gives you an opportunity to tech into Celestial if you really want, for example. But, you know, you don't really need that compared to just getting the 6 Blade Master and 3 Cybernetic online. If you want to play around a Fast 9 strategy, this is like how you end up approaching it. You end up putting things like Astro together with bars so you can ramp a ton of meeps. And you combine it with a bunch of augments that either give you a bunch of gold or a lot of HP and times you can hit your Fast 9 board. This core ends up being really solid to play around, and you kind of mix and match a bunch of different things. You want to make sure you have 2 carries and 2 utility units. So that way you can find a way to mix and match whatever makes sense. Best utility units, in my opinion, are Lulu and Thresh, because Thresh ends up summoning more things off your board, and Lulu ends up doing a really nice polymorph and stun, as well as giving you damage amp. But Janna and Urgot are also really good. Urgot is a 1 cast 1 kill, similar to Cassante from set 9 or Lee Sin from set 4. And then Janna is team-wide attack speed buff and AoE CC, plus a Paragon trait that transports attack into magic damage, so ends up making things like Spark and Shiv really, really valuable. And then you want to have 2 out of these 3 units, which is Aurelion Sol, Xerath, and Gangplank, and ideally items for it. So you can kind of play around some flex concepts. Like Xerath is really good with attack speed. So if you play like Rageblade Shojin, and let's say you're playing Bard with Ashe and Teemo, and you have Celestial Snipers with Astro, you can do something like that into Xerath. You can also just put straight up AP items on Gangplank, which is really good. Don't forget Edge of Night because he's a melee carry. And then Aurelion Sol is actually quite solid as well. Just make sure you give him Gunblade and a bunch of AP items. Morello is also really good for him to burn the entire board. But don't forget that you don't have to play around 5 cost. You can also play around like 4 cost mixtures as well. So, you know, if you end up playing around this core, you drop Bard once you get to level 9 because you don't need more meeps. And then you can play like Teemo plus another sniper plus like another carry from here. It's just very open-ended, which is why people loved playing it. It was one of the first true iterations of Fast 9 Flex that a lot of people loved. And so if you enjoy that kind of style, make sure to give it a try every time you have a setup like this. Battlecast reroll is pretty straightforward. You're always rolling for Kog'Maw 3 plus the other Battlecast units. The priority goes Kog'Maw, then Alawi, then Nocturne, and then Cassiopeia. But in reality, the priority for reroll is Kog'Maw, then Alawi. Then ideally, I think you get Rakan 3 because you're going to lack a little bit of frontline, and finally Cassio 3, but you're unlikely to hit her because she's the final piece of it. And you actually are much more likely to push to level 7 and 8 anyways, because if you can find a way to get Victor and Urgot for 6 Battlecast, 6 Battlecast is worth at that point because you get a lot of magic damage. And for the very same reason, if you end up getting a Battlecast, which is a Rod and a Spatula, you end up wanting to put Battlecast emblems onto everybody because it ends up being really solid. Gnar is a better brawler than Vi. It's just hard to get because you're rolling at level 6 for a Kog'Maw for slow rolling. But outside of this, you play pretty much the core of 2 brawlers plus the Battlecast if you can. And if you can get Nocturne 3, that's great, but not that important. Good augments are things that give you attack speed or just the item straight up. Like Lucky Streak is the Gambler's Blade for Kog'Maw, which is good because it gives a little bit of AP and shock treatment for Kog'Maw. And Healing Orbs is surprisingly a lot better than the Vampirism because Kog'Maw will be able to help sustain and keep these units alive, and that ends up being a lot more effective for the flat HP than something that just scales like Vampirism. So yeah, hit Kog'Maw 3 at 6, push levels, add in the more battle casts, tech in whatever else you think it can work, and get that solid top 4. Chrono Caitlyn is also another variation you can play that is kind of a hybrid of a lot of things that we talked about. It has a little bit aspect of like the Celestial Protector that makes it very good with the attack speed and reroll, as well as the Chrono aspect of attack speed. It's just a really fun comp to play because you get Caitlyn 3 and then you try to have her snipe and get as many casts as possible. A lot of people play JG as her 3rd item, but you can probably just justify a bunch of different stuff like Giant Slayer or go for other different things that cap out her damage. And if you're able to get like Ashe as the Rageblade Shojin as a secondary, ends up being, again, like the spam casting thing that's really, really funny. For that very reason, Pandora's ends up being kind of solid because you kind of want specific items on Shen. Okay, not the second Bramble, my bad. That meant to be Declaw. Whoopsie daisies. You need a ton of goals. So Prismatic Ticket, Infernal Contract, really good because you want a 3-star Shen, you want a 3-star Caitlyn, you want a 3-star probably TF as well, like Rakan, Ashe. In fact, there's no unit you don't want a 3-star in this composition, so it's a really big emphasis on the D key. You want to position, so you try to snipe the opposite side of the whatever carry you want to go up against. So if you see like an other Ashe or you see like a Teemo or Syndra or something else on the other side, just try to position Caitlyn accordingly. And make sure Jarvan is nearby so you can get the raw attack speed as well. Also, if you are wondering, yes, Sniper's Focus is very good on Caitlyn because she usually hits whatever is on the other side, so it ends up being extremely powerful if you're able to get that on her. But it loses a lot of value in the late stages of the game, and so it's actually a lot better on someone else like Ashe or whoever else you end up putting snipers in. If you do end up playing for the late game, you want to make sure to just add more snipers in like Jhin and Teemo, and that's the way you can outfit the rest of your composition. When you're playing playing Shaco, make sure you get a mixture of Darkstar and Infiltrator, because Darkstar is basically Gifts of the Fallen, and as a result, you actually don't really need Gifts of the Fallen. It's kind of just like half of a Darkstar value. Instead, you want to go for things like Not Today, which is really good, gives them the Edge of Night immediately. Yeah, My Sword is also good because you want Edge of Night, you want Infinity Edge. Bloodthirster is also good. This is just a crit build, for example, that you can play. Anything that gives healing like Vampirism, very, very good as well. Make sure you stack Mordekaiser 3 as your front line. You actually have options of putting him here, and in the past, we used to actually do something kind of crazy, like put these units in the back in the third and fourth row, so that way the units walk forward and it de-corners units. But just play around with it and see what makes sense, and keep an eye out for Shaco to jump onto the correct target based off the back line. So if you see Teemo's in the top left, jump Shaco in the top left. If you see Teemo's in the top right, have Shaco jump to the top right. Also, Karma is kind of nice to give the little shield tethering, but not that important. Fizz is AoE CC. Just make sure that you keep him generically in the center, so that way he has the most impact with AoE. And doesn't really matter what else you really do with your Dark Stars. If you end up leveling, you can end up playing like Jhin, and you can play even Xerath if you are able to cap out high enough. Darkstar Emblem is very good. If you end up getting a Darkstar Emblem, put it on someone like Zed, and because you end up going for a 3-star Zed, and he gets leftover items anyways. Zed's really good with stuff like Hodge and other items that just make sense for assassins, so just give it to him. So this is one variation that you can play if you want. The other variation is predicated around mech. You basically take out the Dark Stars, and then you just type mech units into your search bar, and you just play around Annie, Rumble, Fizz. Remember that the mech is going to summon based off the average placement of the 3 units. So based off of Annie, Rumble, Fizz here, it's going to be in the center. But if you do something like this, like Annie, Rumble, Fizz, and it'll summon where Rumble is, it's just the average of all 3. If you just move Fizz only, the placement of the mech might be like somewhere here and above Rumble. So just keep that in mind. Default positioning is something like here, so you keep it front center, and then you basically just play 4 Infiltrator with this. I think you go for this variation if you hit like a really good augment for mech, like a Gargantuan Resolve. If you hit Gargantuan Resolve and you just end up stacking Rumble with things like Double Titans, this mech becomes actually unkillable. And mech actually really likes Quicksilver as well, so they can just make sure it doesn't get stunned, so you can cast very quickly. So this is like one variation you can play if you hit Gargantuan Resolve. If you just want to play mech just for the good old nostalgia sake, make sure you just play like a traditional fighter setup like Bloodthirster Titans plus Quicksilver here on Rumble. And of course, make sure you go for Rumble 3 and Annie 3. Brawler Jinx is pretty straightforward. You just play 4 Brawlers, 4 Blasters, and you end up just going for Jinx with 80 items. I think Jinx personally is going to be lacking damage if you don't give her straight up AD items. If you put Last Whisper on her, for example, it's going to take away actively from her AD, and without Rebels being active, which gives her bonus damage, you probably just need to rely on a little bit more raw combat strength. Gnar ends up holding Even Shroud because Blitzcrank and Illaoi are not reliable tanks, and also Vi kind of charges the other side. But if you want to, you could probably put Last Whisper on Jinx if you don't really get Even Shroud, and you can go for full tank items if you want to go like Bramble and Declaw on Gnar. This is also totally okay. And so you just play basically like a straightforward comp. It's very easy and simple. The only thing that's really awkward is that all these blasters are AP damage. AP Lucian, AP Kog'Maw, AP Ezreal. So a lot of times you're not actually playing like AD items to get to Jinx on the blasters. You're oftentimes playing something like a Cybernetics and trying to ladder into Jinx, because you end up playing around like Vi and Blitzcrank and Cybernetics early. So it's just a little bit awkward, but if you get to this spot, it ends up being solid enough for a top 4. I do think that if you end up getting some good combat augments, set this up, it ends up being pretty solid top 4. You can also tech in some things like Cybers and Astros and figure out what makes sense for you. 4 Blasters is a lot better than 2, so if you can find a way to get that, it's good. And if you can reroll Kog'Maw and Lucian 3 as well, that might be a good secondary damage source alongside Ezreal. But for full disclosure, this is like one of the only comps I haven't played at 3.5, so it's all theory, and I've seen people do okay with it, but I mean, it's not my favorite comp, and it's just middle of the pack for a reason. Cybernetic Vayne is pretty straightforward. You end up going for Vayne 3 as your main carry, and then maybe like a Vi 3 as well, but she's not really a reliable tank because she charges farther away. I put some of the best items that you can afford to put onto these units. So Vayne wants Rageblade, i.e. Last Whisper. Vi wants something like a Vow so she can cast quickly and get to the back line and just generally bring up a ruckus. For the very same reason, you can also give her Sunfire Cape. Leona just wants defensive items. I really like Thief's Gloves and Thief's Gloves based items. I really is actually really good with AP and AD items because her cast actually scales off of AP really well. Someone actually did the math a long time ago, and we found out that Infinity Edge is actually the same damage as Death Cap. But now that Death Cap actually gives bonus damage, I could actually see Death Cap being just as good, if not better. And so Irelia is just really good with Thief's Gloves, and then that allows you to free up your economy for items to do something else. Echo can play Morello, and then these 2 units, Caitlyn and Riven, are just synergy bots for Chrono and Blade Master. Silver Veil ends up being really convenient because you really want Vayne to be in the corner and to stop the Blitzcrank hook. And also she drops her own aggro, so giving her a little bit of attack speed and that evasion is nice to get her ramping. It's just a straightforward AD comp. The win condition that you actually end up doing very well in is if you hit Irelia 3. I know that sounds kind of ridiculous, but it's not really that consistent of a comp. Plus, there's so many copies in the pool, so a lot of times you're probably going to try to chase for Irelia 3, so don't sell your Irelias. Riven 3 is not particularly super amazing, but Irelia 3 is. She can actually just win the game by herself. If you do get a spatula, people in the past did play something like Blade Master Vayne, and if you did get that, then you probably drop like Riven and you play something else that might make more sense, like a Blitzcrank for the Brawler Chrono. And if you do get Blade Master Vayne, then you probably want to make sure you have like Even Shroud somewhere so you can drop things like Last Whisper, because you don't want to drop your DPS on Vayne. Star Guardians were called E-Girls as the nickname. We didn't have good naming systems back in TFT set 3.5, but that's what we called it. It's a composition that was dependent highly around hitting Syndra 3 as your main carry, with Ari 3 as your secondary, and then Nico 3 as your main tank. You could also play around Annie 3 if you hit Annie 3 way earlier than Nico and you have Annie tank. And you basically try to have Syndra supercharge, because when she casts, she creates new orbs, and then you just keep firing more and more, and you get more mana every time Star Guardians cast. So putting Shojin Nashers on her makes the most sense, and give her some kind of damage item. You can also play Jewel Lotus with this setup, which makes a lot of sense, so that you can have them all crits and then maybe do something else with it, like raw AP. Infusion is really good, gives your entire team mana, which helps accelerate the mana cast. And don't forget about things like Combat Caster, because you're going to be casting a lot. The one thing I will say is that we also figured out that Ari positioning actually matters a lot, because she shoots in a straight line. She fires an orb in a line for her orb deception, but it has a range, so you can actually position her in some weird spots like here and here, try to like angle. It's almost like trying to position a skill shot. And Janna also casts or tornado, and so you kind of fire in a cone. So if she's firing towards the top center, for example, she's going to cast her tornadoes that hit both Syndra and Ari. So this is like one theoretical way that you can position. And then Zoe in the corner stop the Blitzcrank hooks. It's pretty fun. It's pretty spammy. It's also very pretty. A lot of galactical particles and zapping and glitter. So have fun with it. And you're not going to probably top 4 very often, but when you do, you top 4 in style. Vanguard Mystics is predicated around Cassiopeia 3 as your main damage dealer, plus Jace secondary. They're both AP damage dealers, so you kind of want to line up and sync accordingly. Cassiopeia really wants blue buff Gunblade to heal the front line and basically spam cast. And then I suggest Archangels, because she doesn't have anything that inherently gives her a bunch of AP, so giving her more AP scaling is really good. And your win condition is to stall out anyways. Like the longer the fight goes, the more you're going to get strong. Nautilus is probably my ideal third unit that I 3-star on top of Jace and Cassio, and giving things like Redemption is good because you get so much resistances, so the effective HP gain is really nice. If you do end up doing something like this, make sure to position to like get Redemption value here. Not to mention that anything that gives HP like 3's a Crowd, Martyr, Inspiring Epitaph, these are all really good augments to think about that help really make this comp good. But in general, it's pretty slow and gets outscaled. Usually people are playing this right now just for the nostalgia of it, because Vanguard Mystic feels cool, right? Like you're playing an all defensive, outscale your opponent's type of composition. So yeah, you can try to play it if you want, but in general, not that strong. Rebels is a pretty straightforward comp where you're just kind of playing Rebels and clumping it up really often. You just basically try to maximize the amount of bonus damage you can get by having everything shielded, and play around things like Jinx. Maybe you have AP items on Ziggs. In this case, you kind of play like blue buff and AP on Ziggs for some reason. You would probably play around Ziggs and blue buff and try to make sure you cast as much as you can. You can go for Ziggs 3 as a potential way to play around Rebels. And if so, make sure you give him some little bit more bonus damage like this. Aurelion Soul is your top end for your Rebels, and Gangplank is a good demolitionist that ties in with Ziggs, and you want to get all the upgrades you possibly can and have him basically cast and spam as much as you can. Don't forget Shred, so maybe Spark here on Gangplank makes the most sense. Jinx is just your AD item holder. Little Buddies is really good when you're playing kind of vertical, because you have 1, 2, 3, 4 1 to 2 cost units, and that can buff things like your Jinx and Gangplank and Aurelion Soul. And other things like, Idealism, anything that just gives you a lot of items, because in reality, you want to itemize like as many champions as you possibly can. And until you hit Aurelion Soul, you're going to hit something like Zed, so you might end up having Zed hold 80 items, for example, so Zed can hold this until you hit Jinx. And then you hit Jinx, sell to Zed, transfer over, tech into Aurelion Soul, and then you're good to go. Very vulnerable to AoE effects, so got to be really careful about that. Like, if the mech comes in and Garen casts, whoosh, big stun, you're really, really sad. So if you pick up Silver Veil or anything else like that, it can be really, really good. And in the late stage of the game, don't be afraid to try to create some bait stuff. So, maybe Malphite is over here, and all these rebel units are in the bottom left. You know, do something a little bit more improvisation like this, so that way Malphite can draw all the aggression and then, you know, waste all everybody's abilities and then get the rebel value for everybody else. Try not to go too crazy with it. And they did take out keepers, I think, from the augment pool, because I think keepers plus rebels would have been way too nutty. The same reason why they took out cyber augments for cybers. Space Jam, my favorite comp from the set. Honestly, this is the one that I wanted to try immediately when I first played. Space Jam is super funny, and if you get Darius to do the guillotine execute, he will cast again, and targets below 50% HP take double damage. So Darius is really fun, and you get Space Pirate, which is basically like Spoils of War. When you kill, you have a chance of dropping loot, and that helps you snowball your composition. You know, this is a comp that if you're able to get the gangplank and farming a bunch of stuff, you can itemize everybody. In terms of the core units, you're actually just playing Graves, Gangplank, Darius, Jace, plus a Vanguard. And then, I don't know, I just threw in Mystics because, you know, maybe just get some nice balance of Vanguard Mystics. But you could really play like anything you want. You could play more Vanguards if you want. You could probably play another Mana Reaver like Thresh in if you want to tech it in, and then get like a Chrono unit as well. So maybe Wukong instead of Nautilus in this situation. So this is the way you can set up the board. But you're going to roll for Darius and Jace 3 on level 6 or level 7 and try to itemize both of them to snowball your lead. Idealism is really good for this very reason. I mean, you could get Idealism on Jace and Darius. It is important to note that these do not stack, meaning that you don't get double the Idealism value on Darius. And so last time can be just like whatever, really. Especially if you have Vampirism and Healing Orbs and other things like that. You can have Darius, instead of holding this, go for like Giant Slayers, so that way he doesn't get stuck on a tank. Now, if you want the spiciest spicy techs, I looked it up. Twin Terror is actually quite solid in this comp in general. It actually jumps up almost half an average placement entirely. So if you want some real dank tech, try Twin Terror Darius Space Jam. Double the Darius, double your pleasure, double the fun. If you want to have fun, this is the most hilarious comp, I think. And also, I highly recommend you play the Space Jam theme song in the back after you hit Darius 3, because sometimes the timing just lines up immaculately, and it could be the most fun you'll have all set long. So there you have it, my ultimate tier list for set 3.5 revival. It's a lot of fun and a trip down memory lane that I will never forget. I think this is one of my favorite sets ever. I will also say that this is a set that reminds us how far TFT has come along. Why is 80% of the cast AP? Why are the trait webs designed a certain way where it feels like things are unlocked at legendaries or things that you can't really access otherwise? I think we learned so much how to make TFT a good set in terms of balance and design, and I'm looking forward to see what other lessons we can learn from this current set as well. Let me know if you guys have any other comps and techs to recommend trying for set 3.5. Enjoy the rest of the revival, and I'll see you guys next time.